Zelma Mercer stood on the sidewalk outside the Harwick shelter with a garbage bag in each hand and nowhere to go. She was 70 years old. Everything she had owned for the last 38 years had been in the apartment on Colvin Street. The photographs, the kitchen things, the twin bed she had saved 3 months to buy in 1986, and the landlord had taken all of it when she missed the third rent payment in a row. She had one phone with 14% battery left and a name written on a torn piece of envelope in her coat pocket. Her Aunt Vivienne, dead for 11 years, and the address of a beach house in Osprey Neck, Florida, that no one in the family had ever been able to open because no one had ever been able to find the key. That night, sleeping in a chair at the Greyhound station, she found it. And what she discovered inside that house, specifically what she found at the back of a sealed closet, would undo everything she thought she knew about a woman she had loved and barely understood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Zelma Pruitt had been born in Harwick, Pennsylvania, and she had lived there for all 70 years of her life, which meant she had watched the steel plant close and the downtown hollow out and the grocery store on Merchant Street become a check-cashing place, and then an empty lot. She had watched all of it without leaving, because leaving had never been an option she took seriously. Her mother was in Harwick. Then her mother's grave was in Harwick. Her daughter Corinne had grown up there, gone to school there, moved to Atlanta at 22, which Zelma had understood and had not held against her. Zelma had worked at the Harwick Municipal Records Office for 26 years, filing property transfers and birth certificates and zoning applications in the particular way of someone who does a job with care, not because the job demands it, but because she does not know how to do things carelessly. She had been good at it. She had known the filing system better than anyone in the building, better than the supervisors who cycled through every few years, better than the county clerk who had eventually, in 2019, signed the letter that told her the position was being eliminated as part of a budget restructuring that was not personal and was not a reflection of her performance. She had been 66 at the time, old enough that finding another position in Harwick was not a realistic conversation, though she had tried to have it anyway, sending applications to the county courthouse and the school district and the 2 law offices on Center Street that she thought might need someone who understood records. None of them called back. She had her savings, and she had the apartment on Colvin Street, which she had rented for 22 years at a rate that had been reasonable when she moved in and had crept upward in the years, since in the way that rents creep in places where there is not much competition for housing, but there is also not much oversight of the people who provide it. She had managed. For 3 years, she had managed, drawing down the savings carefully, the way she had managed money her whole adult life, with a legal pad and a pencil and a habit of writing the numbers down and looking at them without looking away from the one she didn't like. She had cut the cable, and then the landline, and then the gym membership she had held for 15 years. She had stopped buying the good coffee and started buying the store brand. She had returned library books on time to avoid the fines, which at 25 cents a day she could not afford to treat as optional. The savings ran out in February of 2023. The tax return helped through April. The partial unemployment she had qualified for carried her into July. In August, she missed the first rent payment. In September, she paid half. The landlord, a man she had dealt with exclusively through a property management company for 22 years and had met in person twice, sent a notice that was formal and correct in its language and left her no useful options. She called Corinne in Atlanta. Corinne had driven up on a Saturday, and they had sat at the kitchen table and gone through the paperwork together, the bank statements and the lease and the notice, and Corinne had done what Zelma had known she would do, which was try to find a way out of something that did not have a way out that Zelma could accept. Corinne had offered to send money each month. Zelma had thanked her and declined, because Corinne had 2 children in elementary school and a mortgage of her own, and the money she would send would come from somewhere it was needed. They had talked for 4 hours and arrived at the same conclusion the paperwork had already stated. She had moved out on the 1st of October. She had taken what fit in 2 garbage bags and a rolling suitcase. The furniture she left. The kitchen table she had bought at a yard sale in 1994 and refinished herself over a weekend, she left. The bookshelves, the lamp she had carried from her mother's house after her mother died, The curtain she had sewn herself from fabric she found at the Goodwill on Harrison Street. She left all of it because the shelter on Dunmore Avenue had a single-room policy, and she had learned this by calling ahead because she had spent 26 years in record management, and calling ahead was the kind of thing that was simply how she operated. The shelter was clean, and the staff were kind in the practiced way of people who have learned to be kind without becoming attached, which Zelma understood and did not fault them for. She had a cot and a locker and meals at set times, and the particular quality of sleeplessness that comes from a large room full of people each carrying something that keeps them awake. She lay on the cot in the dark and thought about the apartment on Colvin Street. The specific sound the radiator made in October when the heat came on for the first time, the way the morning light came through the east window and fell on the kitchen counter. The 22 years of mornings she had stood at that counter with a cup of coffee before the day began. She had been there 6 weeks when the letter arrived. It came through Corinne, forwarded from the Colvin Street address, which Corinne had arranged with the post office as a precaution. A letter from the law office of a man named Gerald Whitmore in Osprey Neck, Florida, addressed to Zelma Pruitt as the surviving next of kin of one Vivienne Calloway, deceased. Zelma had not heard Vivienne's name spoken by anyone in 3 years, and seeing it on an envelope in the fluorescent light of the shelter's mailroom stopped her in a way she had not expected. Vivienne had been her mother's older sister. She had been, for the first 20 years of Zelma's life, the most vivid person she knew. Vivienne Calloway had been the kind of woman who filled a room without trying to. Not loudly, not through the performance of personality that some people mistake for presence. She filled a room the way a fire fills one, by being genuinely, specifically itself, and by making everything near it warmer without asking permission. Zelma had understood this about her aunt from the time she was old enough to understand anything about people, which was early, because she had grown up in a house where reading people was a practical skill rather than an optional one. Vivienne had never married. This had been a point of low-grade family commentary for decades, the kind of commentary that gets dressed up as concern but is really just discomfort with a life that doesn't follow the expected sequence. Zelma had never participated in it. She had watched her aunt live a life that was self-constructed and deliberate and full of things that interested her, and she had thought, even as a teenager, that the family's concerns said more about the family than it did about Vivienne. She had been a bookkeeper by trade, working for a small shipping company in Pittsburgh for 30 years, and she had been, by every account Zelma had ever heard, extraordinary at it. She had a gift for numbers that was almost tactile, the way some people have perfect pitch, an ability to feel when something was off before she could articulate why, and to find the source of it with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the looking. She had retired at 62 and moved to Florida, to a town called Osprey Neck on the Gulf Coast, which she had chosen, she told Zelma at the time, because she had driven through it once on her way somewhere else and had stopped for lunch and had not wanted to leave. Zelma had visited her there once, in the summer of 2004, a long weekend that she had taken alone while Corinne was at her father's. Vivienne had been living in a small house 2 blocks from the water, and they had spent 3 days cooking and walking the beach and talking in the way that you talk with someone you are genuinely curious about, which was different from the way Zelma talked with most of the rest of her family. Vivienne had shown her the town, the fish market and the old courthouse and the stretch of beach where the shorebirds gathered at low tide. She had shown her from a distance a property she had recently purchased on the edge of town, a small beach house set back from the road behind a stand of palmetto trees. She had said only that she was working on it, that it was a project, that she would show Zelma properly when it was ready. She had never shown her. The dementia had begun 2 years later, progressing in the particular way of things that move slowly until they don't, and by 2009 Vivienne had moved into a memory care facility in Sarasota, where her cousin Raymond had arranged her affairs with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood logistics and very little else. Vivienne had died in 2012, leaving an estate that Raymond had described to the family as modest and that had been settled without ceremony or much communication. The beach house had not been mentioned. Zelma had not known it still existed until she held Gerald Whitmore's letter in the shelter mail room and read it twice under the fluorescent light. The letter was 3 pages. Whitmore had been Vivienne's attorney for the last decade of her competent life, and the letter explained, In the careful language of a man who had been sitting on information for 11 years waiting for circumstances to align, that Vivienne had left the beach house property at 14, Palmetto Lane in Osprey Neck, to Zelma directly, in a separate document from her general estate, specifically structured so that Raymond's administration of the estate would not include it. He had been waiting, the letter explained, because the original deed transfer had required a secondary probate filing in Harwick County that had taken years to resolve due to a clerical error in the original property records, and the resolution had only come through in October. He apologized for the delay. He included his phone number and an address, and a note that said the property had been maintained under a caretaking arrangement Vivienne had funded through a small trust, and that the trust had been exhausted in 2021, after which the caretaker had continued on a voluntary basis out of what he described as respect for the property and the woman who had owned it. Zelma sat down on the bench beside the mailroom door and read the letter a third time. Then she called Whitmore from the shelter's common room with her phone at 14% battery and her coat still on because she had been about to go out when the mail arrived. Whitmore answered on the second ring. He had a voice that was older than she had expected from the letter, the voice of a man in his late 70s who had been in his mid-60s when Vivienne had trusted him with this. He confirmed everything the letter said. He told her the house had been sealed for 3 years. He told her the key was being held for her at his office. He told her she could come whenever she was ready. She told him she would be there by the end of the week. She called Corinne from the parking lot with 8% battery left and said 4 words before the phone died. "I have somewhere to go." Corinne drove up from Atlanta on a Tuesday and arrived at the Harwick shelter at noon with a full tank of gas, a bag of groceries, and the particular expression of a daughter who has decided to be useful rather than emotional, which Zelma recognized and was grateful for. They had agreed on the phone, once Zelma had borrowed a charger from the shelter front desk and called back, that Corinne would drive her as far as the Florida state line and that Zelma would take the bus the rest of the way. Corinne had objected to this plan and then accepted it because she had learned over 44 years that her mother's plans had an internal logic that was worth respecting even when it was not immediately apparent. They stopped at a diner outside Knoxville for dinner, a place with orange vinyl booze and a pie case by the register and the kind of coffee that has been sitting since 3 in the afternoon and tastes like it. Zelma had the soup and the cornbread. Corinne had eggs. They sat across from each other in the orange booth, and Zelma told her daughter everything she knew about Vivienne, the Pittsburgh years, and the bookkeeping and the beach house she had seen from a distance in the summer of 2004 and had never been shown properly. Corinne listened without her phone on the table, which was how Zelma knew she was listening seriously. Corinne asked what she expected to find. Zelma said she didn't know. Corinne asked what she was hoping for. Zelma was quiet for a moment, and then said she was hoping it was livable, that it had walls and a roof that functioned and a floor that held, that it was something she could be inside rather than something she had to walk away from. She did not say the other thing she was hoping for, which was harder to name and had been sitting in her chest since the shelter mailroom. The sense that Vivienne had reached across 11 years and done something deliberate, something that required Zelma specifically, and that understanding what and why would matter in a way she could not fully articulate over diner coffee in an orange booth in Tennessee. Corinne dropped her at the Chattanooga bus station at 9 in the morning. They stood by the car in the parking lot, and Corinne held her for a long moment without saying anything, which was the right thing. Then she stepped back and looked at her mother with the expression she had worn since she was a child, when she was trying to memorize something she was afraid of losing. "Drive safe," Zelma told her. "That's my line," Corinne said. The bus to Osprey Neck took 11 hours with 2 transfers, one in Atlanta and one in Tampa. Zelma had the window seat on the left side for most of it. She watched the landscape change in the way it changes on that particular route south. The Tennessee hills flattening into Georgia red clay, and then the Georgia clay giving way to the long Florida straightness. The sky opening up and the vegetation thickening into something subtropical, the palms appearing first as novelties and then as simply what the roadside looked like. The light changed too. It had a different quality down here, flatter and more direct, without the angle and shadow of northern light, and it made everything look more exposed, more itself. She had Gerald Whitmore's letter in her bag, and the grocery bag Corinne had packed on the seat beside her. She had a rolling suitcase in the luggage compartment and the photograph of Vivienne in her coat pocket. The one from the 2004 visit, the two of them on the beach with the Gulf behind them, and Vivienne laughing at something that had happened half a second before the picture was taken. A laugh that the photograph had caught mid-arrival, genuine and unposed. Zelma had found in her things when she packed at Colvin Street, and had kept it without deciding to, the way you keep certain things not through intention, but through the hand's knowledge of what matters. She arrived in Osprey Neck at 8:47 in the evening. The bus station was a single room attached to a convenience store 2 blocks from the waterfront, and when she stepped off the bus, the air hit her differently than she expected. Salt and something green underneath it. The particular smell of a coastal town at night when the wind is coming off the water and carrying everything with it. She stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase and breathed it in and thought about Vivienne stopping here for lunch in the 1990s on her way somewhere else and not wanting to leave. She understood it immediately. She understood it the way you understand certain things about a person you loved when you encounter the thing that formed them. Whitmore's office was closed at that hour, which she had expected. She had arranged to pick up the key in the morning. She checked into a motel 2 street from the waterfront, a small, clean place with a ceiling fan and a window that looked out at a live oak draped in Spanish moss. She set the photograph of Vivienne on the nightstand. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the warm Florida night. She did not sleep for a long time. Gerald Whitmore was 78 and moved through his small office on Crane Street with the unhurried precision of a man who has stopped pretending that speed is a virtue. He had a white mustache and reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and the particular manner of someone who has kept the confidence for a long time and is relieved to finally be able to release it. He made coffee before they talked. He set a cup in front of Zelma and sat across from her and told her what he remembered about Vivienne, which was considerable because Vivienne had been, he said, one of the most organized clients he had worked with in 50 years of practice. An organization and a client was something an attorney remembered. He told her that Vivienne had come to him in 2003 with the beach house paperwork and a very specific set of instructions. She had wanted the property held separately from her general estate. She had wanted it to go to Zelma and only to Zelma, and she had been clear that this was not a negotiable point. She had told him, he said, that Zelma was the only person in the family who had ever looked at her without trying to figure out what was wrong with her. He paused after saying this and looked at his coffee cup. He said he thought Zelma should know that. She did not trust herself to respond to that directly, so she thanked him, and he nodded and slid the key across the desk. It was not what she expected. She had pictured something old, something that matched the age of the story, a heavy brass thing with a worn handle. What Whitmore slid across the desk was a standard door key on a simple ring, and attached to the ring with a short piece of ribbon was a small sand dollar. White and intact, the kind you find whole only if you are very lucky or looking very carefully. She closed her hand around it. The caretaker was a man named Darnell Coates, 70 years old, who had lived 3 streets from the property for 30 years and who had been checking on it since Vivienne's trust ran out in 2021 because, as he explained when he met Zelma at the end of the Palmetto Line path at 10 in the morning, he had promised Vivienne he would, and he kept his promises. He had maintained the exterior, cleared the gutters each fall, checked the roof after storms, and run the water periodically to keep the pipes from seizing. He had not gone inside beyond the front room in 3 years, out of a respect for the property's waiting that he did not explain in so many words, but that Zelma understood completely. He walked her up the path and stood back when they reached the front door. The house was small and set back from a road behind the palmettos, which had grown tall enough in 11 years of unmanaged growth to make the property feel private in the way of places that have been left alone long enough to develop their own atmosphere. The exterior was board and batten, painted a gray that had faded towards silver, with dark green shutters and a covered front porch with 2 wooden chairs that had weathered to the same silver gray as the siding. A wind chime hung from the porch eave, copper tubes gone green with salt air, still functional, ringing once in the morning breeze as Zelma stepped onto the porch. She put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance. The inside of the house smelled of closed rooms and salt air, and underneath both of those, faintly, something she could not name for a moment and then could. Vivienne had worn a particular hand lotion that came in a green tube, something with aloe in it, and the smell of the house carried a trace of it in the way that enclosed spaces hold the traces of the people who lived in them long after the living is done. It was faint enough that Zelma was not certain she wasn't inventing it. She was also certain she was not. She stood in the front room and looked. Vivienne was in everything here. The bookshelves that covered the entire north wall, floor to ceiling, still full. The reading chair by the window with a faded blue cushion. The small desk in the corner with a brass lamp, and the particular orderliness of a surface that had been arranged by someone who thought about where things went. The kitchen through the doorway with the yellow curtains, Vivienne's color, the one she had worn and used and surrounded herself with her whole adult life. The floors were pine, worn smooth and golden, and the afternoon light was going to fall on them in a way that Zelma could already see would be worth being there for. She walked through each room with her hand trailing along the walls. She found Vivienne's bedroom, the narrow bed and the quilt folded at the foot of it and the nightstand with a book still on it, face down, holding a place in a story that never got finished. She found a closet at the end of the short hallway. The door was sealed with a strip of painter's tape along all four edges, applied carefully, the way Vivienne did everything. Written on the tape in Vivienne's handwriting, in the black marker she had always used for labeling things, were two words. For Zelma. Her hands were not steady when she pulled the tape free. The closet was not large. It was the kind of storage space that older houses have, narrow and deep, with a single bare bulb on a pull string and wooden shelf along the left wall and a rod along the right for hanging things. Vivienne had used it as an archive. That was the only word for what Zelma found when she pulled the tape free and opened the door and reached for the pull string. Shelves organized with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years keeping books for a shipping company, labeled boxes in Vivienne's handwriting, folders standing upright in plastic organizers, a wooden crate on the floor with its contents wrapped in cloth and arranged by size. The box on the middle shelf had her name on it, not on a label, written directly on the box in black marker, the same hand as the tape on the door, the same deliberate lettering of a woman who wrote as though the writing itself was a form of care. Zelma lifted it down. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it to the reading chair by the window and sat within her lap for a moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, a photograph, and a small leather notebook with a rubber band around it. She read the letter first. Vivienne had written it in 2009, before the diagnosis had progressed to the point where writing was no longer available to her, and the handwriting showed the effort of someone who knew they were in a narrowing window and was using the remaining width carefully. It was 4 pages, which was more than Zelma had ever received from Vivienne in writing, and it said things that Vivienne had apparently spent a long time not saying out loud. She wrote about the summer of 2004, the long weekend visit, Zelma walking the beach in the mornings while Vivienne made coffee, the conversations they had about things the rest of the family considered impractical subjects, the future and the past, and what a life was actually for. She wrote that she had watched Zelma that weekend and had seen a woman who deserved more room than she was giving herself, more space to be in, more of everything. She wrote that she had bought the beach house in 1999 with 40 years of careful saving and the specific intention of leaving it to the person in the family who would know what to do with a room of their own. She had decided on Zelma before the weekend was over. The photograph was from that same visit. It was a different one from the picture Zelma carried in her coat pocket, taken from further back, the two of them small against the width of the gulf behind them, the water going all the way to the horizon. On the back of the photograph, Vivienne had written, in smaller letters than usual, "You belong somewhere beautiful. I found it for you." Zelma sat in the reading chair with the letter and the photograph in her hands, and the morning light coming through the yellow curtains, and she wept in the specific way of someone receiving something they did not know they had been waiting for. She had not cried at the shelter. She had not cried in the orange vinyl booth in Knoxville or on the 11-hour bus ride south. She had been holding it at a careful distance through all of it, managing the distance the way she managed everything, with attention and the willingness to look at hard numbers. She cried now because the distance had closed and there was nothing between her and what Vivienne had done for her and why. She was still sitting in the chair, the letter in her lap, when she heard the car on the Palmetto-lined path. Fletcher Dodd was perhaps 60, with the broad, confident build of a man who had been athletic in his 40s and had not fully revised his self-image since. He wore a linen shirt and leather shoes that were wrong for the sandy path, and he carried a business card between two fingers the way people carry business cards when they have given out enough of them that the gesture has become automatic. He had the smile of someone who has learned that smiling first puts people at a slight disadvantage, a fraction of a second in which they are responding to warmth before they have assessed the situation. He introduced himself at the front porch steps, which he did not climb. Fletcher Dodd, Dodd Coastal Properties. He had heard she had arrived. He wanted to welcome her to Osprey Neck and to introduce himself, and to let her know that if she had any interest at all in discussing the property, he was available at any time and hoped she would think of him first. She looked at him from the porch. She had the sand dollar key ring in her hand, her thumb moving over the surface of it the way it had been moving since Whitmore's office. She asked him how he had heard she arrived. Small town, he said, still smiling. News travels. She thanked him for stopping by. She did not take the card. He sat on the porch railing with the ease of a man accustomed to leaving things behind in case people changed their minds. Then he went back down the path and got into a white car that was newer than anything else on the street and drove away without hurrying, because hurrying would have suggested urgency, and urgency would have suggested that the answer she gave him mattered. It did. She just didn't know yet exactly how much. The leather notebook had belonged to Vivienne for a long time before it became something else. Zelma could tell by the cover, worn soft at the corners in the way of things handled daily for years. The rubber band replaced so many times that the groove it had cut into the leather was deep and permanent. Inside, in Vivienne's small, precise handwriting, was 30 years of financial record-keeping applied to the beach house itself. Every repair, every purchase, every contractor and material and cost, dated and described with the specificity of a woman who had never once confused approximate with accurate. Zelma read through it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had made from the tin she found in the cabinet, still sealed, Vivienne's brand, the same one she had always bought. The records went back to 1999, the year of purchase. The house had been bought outright. No mortgage, paid in full from savings accumulated over 4 decades of careful living. Vivienne had noted the purchase price in the first entry with a single line underneath it and no commentary, which was her way of saying that the number spoke for itself. What the notebook also contained, beginning around 2003 and continuing through 2008, was a second category of entries. Not repairs, acquisitions. Vivienne had been buying things for the house, and the entries described what she had bought and where it had come from with the same precision she applied to everything else. Antique pine furniture from an estate sale in Savannah. Hand-painted tiles from a closing ceramic studio in St. Augustine. A set of wrought iron hardware from a demolished plantation house outside Beaufort. A collection of first-edition natural history books from a retired professor in Tallahassee who had needed to reduce his library before moving. The entries were methodical and the prices recorded were modest. The acquisitions of a woman who knew what things were worth before the people selling them did, which was the same skill that had made her extraordinary at bookkeeping, the ability to feel value accurately before the market had finished forming its opinion. Zelma was reading the 2006 entries when Darnell Coates knocked on the open front door and asked if she needed anything. She told him about the notebook. He came inside and sat across from her and read the entries she pointed to with the expression of a man who was confirming something he had suspected but not fully formed into words. He told her about Clifford Ames. Clifford was 67 and had spent 40 years buying and selling antique furniture and architectural salvage along the Gulf Coast, operating from a warehouse in Osprey Neck that looked from the outside like a place that stored boat equipment and contained, on the inside, what Clifford described as the best inventory of pre-Civil War Southern furniture still in private hands. Darnell had known him for 20 years. He said that if anyone could tell Zelma what Vivienne had actually assembled inside this house, it was Clifford. He made a call from the front porch. Clifford arrived within the hour. He was a tall man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the hands of someone who had been lifting and moving heavy old things since his 20s. He shook Zelma's hand, and looked around the front room, and was quiet for a moment in the specific way of someone recalibrating their expectations upward. He asked if he could look through the house. She said yes. He spent 90 minutes going through every room, crouching to look at joints and undersides of furniture, holding the hand-painted tiles at an angle to the light, opening and closing the wrought iron cabinet hardware with the attention of a man for whom the quality of a hinge was a meaningful sentence. When he came back to the kitchen table, he sat down and was quiet again for a moment before speaking. He told her that the pine furniture Vivienne had bought at the Savannah estate sale was pre-revolutionary, American, likely Virginia or Carolina in origin, and that pieces of that provenance in that condition were not regularly available on the open market because there were not many of them left. He told her the hand-painted tiles were from a studio whose work had in the years since the studio closed become sought after by collectors and interior designers who knew what they were looking for, and that a complete set in a functioning installation, which is what Vivienne had created in the kitchen, was rarer than individual pieces. He told her the first edition natural history books were worth more than Vivienne had paid for all of them combined, and that 3 of them specifically would interest the rare books market considerably. He set his glasses down on the table and looked at Zelma directly. "Your aunt," he said, "spent 10 years assembling something that the people selling it to her did not fully understand they had. She did it quietly, and she did it accurately, and she documented everything, which means the provenance is clean and verifiable." He tapped the leather notebook. "This is as important as the pieces themselves." He told her the house was not a property with contents. He said what Vivienne had built here was a collection with a house around it. Zelma looked out the window at the palmettos moving in the afternoon wind. She thought about Vivienne in Pittsburgh, 30 years as shipping company, keeping books with perfect accuracy for people who probably never fully understood what they had in her either. She had always known what things were worth, Zelma said, before anyone else did. Clifford looked at her. "Still runs in the family," he said. Nora Fielding had been practicing property and estate law in Osprey Neck for 28 years, which meant she had seen most of the ways that inherited property could go wrong and a fair number of the ways it could go right. And she had developed over those 28 years the particular directness of a person who has learned that clarity delivered early is kinder than reassurance delivered late. Clifford had recommended her. Darnell had confirmed the recommendation. Zelma had called her the morning after Clifford's visit, and they had met in Nora's office on the 2nd floor of a building that looked out over the waterfront, the gulf visible between 2 newer buildings like a painting hung in a gap between frames. Nora had read the deed and the letter and the notebook and Clifford's written assessment, which he had prepared and delivered to Zelma within 48 hours of his visit, because he was, as Darnell had described him, a man who did what he said he would do at the speed he said he would do it. She read everything without interrupting herself to comment, which Zelma appreciated. When she finished, she set the papers in a neat stack and looked across the desk. The property itself, she said, had appreciated considerably since Vivienne's purchase in 1999. Osprey Neck had been discovered in the intervening years by the kind of people who discovered coastal towns before they became expensive and then made them expensive by arriving. And the result was that the land value on Zelma's parcel was significantly higher than anything Vivienne had paid or anticipated. This was the number Fletcher Dodd had been circling. It was a real number, and it would solve real problems, and Nora stated it without editorializing because it deserved to be heard clearly. The contents of the house, based on Clifford's assessment and the provenance documentation in Vivienne's notebook, represented a separate and additional value that had nothing to do with the land. There were buyers for the furniture and the tiles and the books who would pay prices that Zelma found difficult to hold in her head as real because they were the kind of numbers that belonged to a different category of life than the one she had been living. Nora named them anyway. She said Zelma deserved to know the full picture before making any decisions, and that the full picture included every number in it. Zelma listened and wrote things on the legal pad she had brought because she did not trust herself to hold figures of this size accurately in memory, and accuracy was what the situation required. She asked careful questions. Nora answered them without simplifying, which was the right approach. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Zelma sat with her legal pad and looked at what she had written and was quiet for a moment. Then she told Nora her idea. She had arrived at it the night before, sitting on the back porch of the beach house with the Gulf wind coming through the palmettos and the leather notebook in her lap. She had been thinking about Vivienne and about what Vivienne had actually built here, not the financial value of it, which was real, but the intention behind it. Vivienne had spent 10 years making something beautiful in a deliberate and specific way, acquiring things that were worth more than their price because she could see what others missed, arranging them in a house 2 blocks from the water in a town she had chosen because she had stopped there for lunch and not wanted to leave. She had built a place that was worth being inside. She had built it for Zelma, which meant she had built it knowing Zelma's eye, knowing what Zelma would see when she walked through the rooms, knowing it would be recognized. Selling it to Fletcher Dodd meant a white car in the palmetto-lined path and a demolition permit and a specific erasure of everything Vivienne had seen and chosen and placed with care over a decade. The furniture would be dispersed. The tiles would be torn out. The wrought iron hardware would go into a skip. The yellow curtains in the kitchen would simply be gone. She was not going to do that. What she told Nora was this. She wanted to keep the house and open it carefully, selectively, to the kind of guests who would understand what they were staying inside. Not a hotel, not a rental property in the ordinary sense. For rooms offered through the networks that Clifford knew, the collectors and the architects, and the people who traveled specifically to be in places that had been made with genuine attention. Guests who would sit at the antique pine table in the kitchen and understand what the table was. Who would notice the hand-painted tiles and ask about them. Who would pull one of the first edition natural history books from the shelf and read it in the reading chair by the window with the Gulf light coming through the yellow curtains and understand that being in this room was not an ordinary thing. Nora listened to all of it without writing anything down. When Zelma finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was possible, that the zoning would require a variance application and the insurance would need specific riders and the tax structure would benefit from a particular kind of LLC arrangement that Nora could set up. She said she had handled similar structures for 2 other historic properties on the coast and knew the process well. She asked Zelma when she wanted to start. Zelma looked out the window at the Gulf visible between the 2 buildings, the afternoon light on it doing what afternoon light on the Gulf does in October, which is to make everything it touches look like it was made to be looked at. Monday, she said. She wanted to start Monday. The renovation took 3 months. Zelma managed it from inside the house, which she moved into during the first week, because the alternative was the motel 2 streets from the waterfront, and the motel cost money the house did not. She slept in Vivienne's narrow bed under Vivienne's folded quilt, and woke each morning to the sound of the Gulf wind in the palmettos and the particular quality of the light that came through the east-facing bedroom window at 6 in the morning and fell on the pine floor in a long rectangle that moved as the sun rose. She was present at the house every day. She asked questions and followed up on the answers and caught 2 separate errors in the plumbing estimate before work began that would have cost her considerably more to address after the fact. 26 years in records management had given her an eye for where documentation was incomplete and an instinct for the questions that needed asking before things were in the walls rather than after. The contractors learned quickly that she was not a client who could be managed with reassurances. She kept everything Vivienne had chosen. The pine furniture stayed. The hand-painted tiles stayed. The wrought iron hardware stayed. The first edition books stayed on the shelves Vivienne had placed them on, organized the way Vivienne had organized them, by subject and then by date, the natural world arranged chronologically as humans had come to understand it. She added only what was necessary and what was consistent with what Vivienne had built, linens and colors that worked with the yellow curtains, a proper coffee station in the kitchen because guests would need coffee in the mornings, a small plaque by the front door that Darnell helped her have made. It read, "Built by Vivienne Calloway, kept by Zelma Pruitt, for everyone who knows what a room can hold." The guest house opened on a Thursday in January, which was not the most strategic month for a coastal property opening, as Nora had pointed out, and which Zelma had chosen anyway, because January was when it was ready, and she had learned over 70 years that waiting for the right moment was frequently how the right moment became a missed one. Clifford had sent word through his networks in November, a single email to a list he had been building for 30 years, describing the property with the specificity that the property deserved. The response had been more than Zelma had anticipated and exactly what Clifford had predicted, which told her something useful about Clifford. The first guests arrived on a Friday, a couple from Savannah, both architects, who had driven 4 hours and arrived with the particular alertness of people who look at built things for a living and are accustomed to being disappointed by what they find when they arrive. They were not disappointed. Zelma watched the woman stop in the doorway of the front room and stand very still for a moment, looking at the pine furniture and the hand-painted tiles visible through the kitchen doorway and the shelves of natural history books along the north wall. Her husband put his hand on her shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then the woman looked at Zelma and said, "Who did this?" "My Aunt," Zelma said, "and then me." She told them the story over coffee that first morning, sitting at the antique pine table in the kitchen with the yellow curtains letting in the January light. She told them about the shelter in Harwick and a letter from Whitmore and the bus ride south and the sealed closet door with her name on the tape. She told them about Vivienne in Pittsburgh, 30 years of keeping books for a shipping company, 40 years of careful saving, 10 years of buying things that were worth more than their price because she had an eye that the sellers did not know they were dealing with. She told them about the leather notebook with every acquisition documented in small, precise handwriting. The provenance chain so clean and complete that Clifford had said it was as valuable as the pieces themselves. The architects listened the way people listen to things that are true and specific and arrive from a direction they were not expecting. Before they left on Sunday, the woman asked if she could write about the house for a journal she contributed to, an architecture and preservation quarterly with a readership that was small and specific and exactly the audience, she said, that would understand what was here. Zelma said yes. The piece ran in March and generated more inquiries than Zelma and Nora's LLC structure was initially prepared to handle, which was a problem of the kind that Zelma found she was able to approach without panic, because it was a problem with a shape she could work with. By April, the calendar was booked through August. By June, Clifford had connected her with a preservation organization in Charleston that wanted to use the house for a 2-day symposium on antebellum furniture provenance, bringing 12 specialists into the space for a weekend and generating a fee that covered 4 months of operating costs. Nora restructured the LLC to accommodate the event income. Zelma added a 6th room that had previously been storage, furnished it from an estate sale in Pensacola that Clifford found, and described to her in enough detail that she could decide from the description, because her eye had become, over 6 months of living with Vivienne's choices, more accurate than it had been before. Fletcher Dodd drove past on a Tuesday in May in the same white car, moving slowly enough that she could see his face through the passenger window from the front porch where she was drinking her morning coffee. He did not stop. He did not leave a card. She watched the car until it reached the end of Palmetto Lane and turned onto the main road and was gone. She picked up her coffee. Corinne came down for a week in July and slept in a room with the wrought iron hardware and the view of the palmettos and spent 3 days asking questions about every piece in the house, which Zelma answered from the leather notebook and from memory, because she had read the notebook often enough that Vivienne's entries had become her own. On the last evening, they sat on the back porch in 2 wooden chairs that faced the Gulf and watched the sun go down over the water the way it went down on this stretch of coast in July, the sky going pink and then deep orange and then the particular red that lasts only a few minutes and that people who have never seen a Gulf sunset do not quite believe when you describe it. Corinne asked if she was happy. Zelma thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Corinne had asked it seriously and it deserved a serious answer. She thought about the shelter on Dunmore Avenue and the cot and the fluorescent mail room and the garbage bags on the Harwick sidewalk. She thought about Vivienne stopping for lunch in Osprey Neck in the 1990s and not wanting to leave. She thought about the sealed closet door and the 2 words written on the tape in black marker and the sand dollar on the key ring, and what it felt like to turn a key in a lock and have a door open into something that had been waiting for you specifically. She thought about the leather notebook and the 40 years of careful saving and the 10 years of careful choosing and the letter written in 2009 by a woman in a narrowing window, using the remaining width to say the thing she had not said out loud. "You belong somewhere beautiful. I found it for you." She looked at the Gulf going dark in the last of the July light, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to get here and the weight of everything it had cost, and the specific quality of being in a place that was already yours before you knew it existed. "I'm where I'm supposed to be," she told Corinne. "That's the closest I can get." Corinne reached over and took her hand. They sat there until the last of the light was gone, and the gulf was dark, and the palmetto fronds were moving in the night wind, and the wind chime on the front porch was ringing faintly, the copper tubes green with salt air, the sound carrying through the house that Vivienne had found and Zelma had kept, and that now held, every week, people who came specifically because they understood what a room made with genuine attention was worth being inside. She had come to Osprey Neck with 2 garbage bags and a photograph and a name on a torn envelope. She had found a sealed door with her name on it. She had opened it and found everything Vivienne had left her, the letter and the photograph and the leather notebook and 30 years of a woman's clear seeing, all of it held in a house 2 blocks from the water in a town that Vivienne had chosen because she had stopped there once and not wanted to leave. The bank in Harwick had the apartment on Colvin Street. It had the kitchen table from a 1994 yard sale and the lamp from her mother's house and the curtains she had sewn herself from Goodwill fabric. It had 22 years of a life built in one place, accumulated and then surrendered in 2 garbage bags on a sidewalk on a cold October morning. It did not have this. It had never known this existed. And what Vivienne had left her, in a sealed closet in a house in a town on the Gulf Coast, was something no landlord and no property management company and no formal notice of any kind could touch. It was hers. It had always been hers. Vivienne had decided that before Zelma knew she needed it. If Zelma's story touched something in you today, hit that like button so it can reach someone who needs it. A warm embrace to each and every one of you. We'll see you in the next one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.